The soft hum of chatter and clinking dishes filled the cozy diner as Olivia hurried between tables, balancing a tray of coffee cups and warm plates. She had worked here for years, long enough to recognize the regulars and their usual orders. But today, a new customer caught her attention, a man in an expensive suit sitting alone in the corner booth. His sharp features and deep-set eyes carried a distant, unreadable expression, as if he were lost in thought. Olivia didn't have time to wonder about him. Her focus shifted to the small boy sitting at a table near the window. His tiny hands gripped a spoon awkwardly, his movements slow and careful. His wheelchair was pushed close to the table, and though he was clearly struggling to eat on his own, no one was there to help him. Olivia glanced around. Where was his guardian? A lump formed in her throat. The boy reminded her of her little brother, who had once needed extra care before he passed away. Without hesitation, she knelt beside him, gently guiding his hand to scoop up a bite of mashed potatoes. "There you go, sweetheart," she said with a warm smile. "Nice and easy." The boy's eyes lit up, and for the first time, he managed to bring the spoon to his mouth without spilling. A small giggle escaped his lips. Olivia chuckled softly, wiping a bit of food from his cheek. She had no idea that, from across the diner, the man in the expensive suit was watching her every move. His expression, once unreadable, had shifted into something else, something deeper. Unbeknownst to Olivia, this man was Nicholas Carter, a billionaire businessman known for his ruthless decisions and cold demeanor. To the world, he was a man of power and wealth, someone who had everything money could buy. But in this moment, watching a kind-hearted waitress feed his son with such patience and care, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. He had brought his son, Ethan, out for lunch in an attempt to bond, something he rarely had time for. Ever since the accident that left Ethan unable to walk, Nicholas had buried himself in work, avoiding the painful reality of his son's struggles. He had hired the best therapists, the most experienced caregivers, but none of them had ever looked at Ethan the way this waitress did. With kindness, with genuine care. Olivia still had no idea who Nicholas was. To her, he was just another customer. And Ethan, just another child who needed a little extra help. She didn't expect anything in return. But Nicholas knew in that moment that this simple act of kindness was about to change Olivia's life in ways she could never imagine. And then, just as she turned to leave, Nicholas spoke. His voice was deep, deliberate. "What's your name?" Olivia looked up, slightly startled. "Olivia," she answered hesitantly. Nicholas nodded, as if making a silent decision. "Thank you for helping my son." She smiled. Anyone would have done the same. But Nicholas knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would stop. Not everyone would care. And what Olivia didn't know was that this day, this small moment, was the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would change her life forever. Olivia felt a strange unease as she walked away from the table, but she shook it off and continued with her shift. It wasn't every day that a man like Nicholas Carter walked into the little diner, let alone spoke to her. There was something intense about the way he looked at her, like he was trying to figure something out. But she didn't dwell on it. She had bills to pay, a long shift ahead, and no time to wonder about the thoughts of a wealthy stranger. Across the diner, Nicholas watched Olivia move effortlessly between tables, refilling coffee cups, laughing with customers, and treating everyone with the same warmth she had shown Ethan. It was rare to see someone so genuine. Most people, when they recognized him, either treated him with fake politeness or outright fear. But Olivia hadn't flinched when he spoke to her. She wasn't intimidated by his presence, and she didn't look at Ethan with pity, only kindness. Ethan was still smiling, his eyes following Olivia as she worked. Nicholas's heart ached at the sight. He had spent so much money trying to give his son the best care, but he had never stopped to think that maybe what Ethan needed most wasn't therapy or expensive treatments. Maybe he just needed someone to treat him like any other kid. Nicholas sighed and glanced at his watch. His schedule was packed. Meetings, phone calls, decisions that could change the course of companies. But for the first time in a long time, none of it felt important. He cleared his throat and turned back to Ethan. "Did you like her?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "She's nice, Dad. She talks to me like I'm normal." Nicholas's chest tightened at those words. Normal. That was all his son wanted. To feel like every other kid, not a burden, not someone who needed to be taken care of. Before Nicholas could respond, Olivia appeared again, this time with a check. "No rush," she said with a friendly smile. "Take your time." Nicholas reached for his wallet, but before he could pull out his card, Olivia placed her hand lightly on the table. "Actually, I just wanted to say something." He raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." She hesitated for a moment, glancing at Ethan, then back at Nicholas. I don't know your situation and I don't mean to overstep, but I see a lot of parents with their kids in here. And I just wanted to say, you're doing great." Nicholas stared at her, caught off guard. He was used to people telling him he was successful, powerful, even intimidating. But no one had ever told him he was doing great as a father. In fact, he had spent the last few years feeling like he was failing Ethan in every way. He swallowed hard, not sure how to respond. Olivia must have noticed because she smiled again, softer this time. "That's all. I just thought you should know." And with that she walked away. Nicholas sat in stunned silence, her words echoing in his head. He was doing great. Was he? He had thrown himself into work, thinking that providing for Ethan was enough. But had he really been there for him? Had he been the father his son needed? Ethan tugged on his sleeve, breaking him from his thoughts. "Dad!" Nicholas looked at him. "Yeah, buddy. Can we come back here again?" Nicholas exhaled slowly, glancing toward Olivia as she laughed with an elderly couple at another table. Then he looked back at Ethan and nodded. "Yeah, we can." The next day, Olivia was back at work, wiping down the counter when she heard the familiar sound of the diner door swinging open. She turned, expecting to see a regular, but instead, she found herself staring at Nicholas and Ethan again. She blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected them to come back. Most wealthy people didn't visit the same small diner twice. "Back so soon?" she asked with a teasing smile. Ethan grinned. "Yeah, Dad said we could." Olivia's heart warmed at the excitement in his voice. She glanced at Nicholas, who gave a small shrug. Ethan insisted. She laughed. "Well, I'm glad you're here. Same table." Ethan nodded eagerly, and Olivia led them to the same spot by the window. As she took their order, Nicholas found himself watching her again. There was something different about her, something he couldn't quite place. She wasn't just kind, she was thoughtful. She didn't act like she was just doing her job. He cared. And for the first time in years, Nicholas found himself wanting to know more about someone outside of his business world. As the meal went on, Olivia noticed something unusual. Nicholas, the billionaire businessman, wasn't focused on his phone or his watch. He was focused on his son. She watched as he listened to Ethan talk about his favorite cartoons, his hobbies, and his dreams of traveling one day. And for the first time since she had met them, she saw Nicholas smile. Not a polite or businesslike smile, but a real, genuine one. It was a small thing, but it made Olivia's chest tighten. She had seen so many families drift apart because of work, stress, or life's endless struggles. But maybe, just maybe, this one still had a chance to grow closer. What Olivia didn't know was that Nicholas had made a silent decision that day. He had seen something in her, something rare. And whether she realized it or not, she had already changed his perspective on fatherhood, on life itself. But he wasn't done yet. Because Nicholas Carter wasn't the kind of man to walk away from something, or someone, that left an impact on him. And Olivia had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Olivia didn't think much of Nicholas's return at first. Customers came and went, and sometimes they became regulars. But as the days passed, she noticed something. He kept coming back. It wasn't every day, but often enough that she started expecting him. He always sat at the same table with Ethan, always ordered coffee for himself and something simple for his son. And every time he watched her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but as if he was trying to understand her. She didn't know what to make of it. A man like him had no reason to spend time in a small diner like this. She wasn't naive. She had seen enough wealthy people to know they usually kept to their own world. But Nicholas Carter didn't seem like the type to waste his time. One evening, after the last rush of customers had left, Olivia was wiping down a table when she felt someone approach. She turned to find Nicholas standing there, his expression unreadable as always. "You work a lot," he said. It wasn't a question. She raised an eyebrow. "Well, yeah. That's how jobs work." His lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Do you ever take a break?" Olivia shrugged. "Not really an option." Nicholas studied her for a moment. "Why not?" She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Because bills don't care if you're tired." Nicholas didn't respond right away. Olivia wasn't sure why he was asking about her life, but she wasn't in the mood for small talk. It had been a long shift, and she still had to close up. "Well," she said, shifting the conversation. "What about you? Don't you have a business empire to run?" "I do," he admitted. But Ethan wanted to come back. At the mention of his son, Olivia's expression softened. She glanced over at the boy, who was happily coloring on the placemat with the crayons she had given him earlier. "He's a great kid," she said. Nicholas nodded, but something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite read. "He is." For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say more, but instead, he pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to her. Olivia glanced down at it, confused. His name was printed in bold, elegant letters, along with a number. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call me." Olivia frowned. "Why would I need to call you?" Nicholas hesitated before answering. "Because I think you deserve more than this place." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and confusing. Olivia wasn't sure if she should be flattered or offended. She had worked hard to survive, and she didn't need anyone, especially not a billionaire, to tell her she needed saving. "I appreciate it," she said carefully, handing the card back. "But I'm fine." Nicholas didn't take it. He simply met her gaze and said, "Just keep it." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his son. Olivia watched him go, her fingers tightening around the card. Something about Nicholas Carter unsettled her, not in a bad way, but in a way she couldn't explain. She had spent so long fending for herself that she didn't know what to do with someone who wanted to help. And she couldn't help but wonder, why her? The next few days passed uneventfully, but Olivia couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. She kept Nicholas's card tucked away in her apron, though she had no intention of using it. Still, she found herself watching him more closely when he came in. And then one night everything changed. It was late, and Olivia was walking home after her shift. The streets were quiet, the air cool. She had taken this route 100 times before, but tonight something felt off. She heard footsteps behind her, slow at first, then picking up speed. Her pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, but the streetlights cast long shadows, making it hard to see. Then suddenly, voice, "Hey!" She spun around, her heart pounding. A man stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He was watching her too closely, his eyes sharp with something she didn't like. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping closer. Olivia swallowed hard. "I'm in a hurry." The man smirked. "Come on, don't be like that. Just want to talk." Her grip tightened around her bag. She knew how these situations went. She had been through enough to recognize when someone wasn't just looking for conversation. She took a step back, but before she could move any further, headlights flooded the street. A sleek black car pulled up beside her, the door opening before it even fully stopped. "Get in," a familiar voice said. Olivia's head snapped toward the car. "Nicholas." She hesitated for only a second before making a decision. Without looking back at the stranger, She darted toward the car and slid into the passenger seat. The door shut behind her, and before she could say anything, Nicholas hit the gas. The silence in the car was thick. Olivia's hands were still shaking slightly, but she clenched them in her lap, refusing to let it show. Nicholas didn't say anything for a while. Then, in a low, controlled voice, he asked, "Why are you walking home alone this late?" Olivia exhaled, her nerves still raw. "Because I don't have a car." Nicholas's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "That's not safe." She let out a dry laugh. "Tell me about it." He didn't seem amused. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Do you always handle things on your own?" "Yeah," she said simply. "I don't have a choice." Nicholas didn't respond right away, but something in his posture shifted. It was the same look he had when he watched Ethan, the look of a man realizing something he should have noticed sooner. "I'll have someone drive you from now on," he said firmly. Olivia frowned. "That's not necessary." "It is," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And it's not up for discussion." She turned toward him, frustrated. "Nicholas, I'm not some—" She stopped herself before saying charity case. But he knew. He glanced at her, his gaze steady. "I know you don't want help," he said. "But that doesn't mean you don't need it." Olivia let out a slow breath. She didn't know why he cared. She didn't understand what he saw in her that made him keep coming back. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the ride. But as Nicholas pulled up to her small apartment, Olivia finally broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away. Then finally he said, "Because you remind me of someone I lost." Olivia's breath caught, but before she could ask what he meant, Nicholas looked away. "Get some rest, Olivia." She stepped out of the car, watching as he drove off into the night. And for the first time since she met him, she realized. Nicholas Carter wasn't just here for Ethan. He was here for her too. The next few days passed in a blur, but Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that her life had shifted in a way she couldn't explain. Nicholas Carter had stepped into her world like an unstoppable force, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself that it didn't mean anything, deep down she knew it did. Every evening, without fail, a black car would be waiting for her outside the diner. Sometimes Nicholas was in it, sometimes it was a driver he had sent. At first, Olivia had resisted, insisting that she was fine walking home. But Nicholas wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer. Eventually she stopped arguing. Still, she didn't understand his motives. Why was a billionaire so invested in her life? He had said she reminded him of someone, but he hadn't said who. She wanted to ask, but every time she worked up the nerve, something stopped her. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. One evening, as she finished wiping down the counter, she turned to find Nicholas sitting at his usual table, watching her. Ethan was drawing on a napkin, humming to himself. Olivia felt the familiar tug in her chest. That kid had a way of making everything feel lighter. She walked over, crossing her arms. "You know, for someone who probably has access to the best restaurants in the world, you sure spend a lot of time in this little diner." Nicholas smirked slightly. "Maybe I like the coffee." She gave him a knowing look. "You don't even drink coffee." Ethan giggled, as if enjoying their back and forth. Nicholas glanced at his son, then back at Olivia, his smirk fading. "Maybe I like the company." There it was again, that weight in his voice, like he wanted to say something more but wouldn't let himself. Olivia's stomach twisted. She wanted to push, to ask him why he really kept coming back, but before she could, the diner door swung open. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She was elegant, dressed in a fitted coat with a designer purse slung over her arm. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before locking onto Nicholas. Olivia didn't have to ask to know who she was. Ethan's mother. Nicholas's expression darkened, his entire body tensing as she approached. Olivia had never seen him look this way before, like he was bracing for a fight. "Nicholas," the woman said, her voice smooth but cold. "I didn't expect to find you here." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "What do you want, Claire?" Claire's eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Olivia. She didn't bother hiding her disapproval. "We need to talk. Alone." Nicholas glanced at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Olivia. "Will you stay with him for a moment?" Olivia nodded, sensing the tension thick in the air. She sat down next to Ethan, offering him a warm smile while Nicholas and Claire stepped outside. Ethan didn't seem bothered. He kept drawing, but Olivia could see the way his small fingers gripped the crayon a little tighter. "She doesn't visit often, does she?" she asked gently. Ethan shook his head, his expression neutral, as if he had long accepted it. "She doesn't like me much." Olivia's heart clenched. "That's not true, Ethan." He shrugged. "She thinks I'm too much work." Olivia swallowed the lump in her throat. No child should ever feel that way, especially not one as bright and kind as Ethan. Outside, Nicholas and Claire were arguing. Olivia couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see it. The way Claire's hands moved sharply, the way Nicholas's expression darkened with every word. Then suddenly, Claire turned on her heel and stormed away. Nicholas ran a hand through his hair before coming back inside. He sat down, his face unreadable, but Olivia could feel the anger radiating off of him. Ethan looked up. "She's not staying." Nicholas's face softened as he reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "No, buddy. She's not." Ethan only nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Olivia's heart ached for them both. After a moment of silence, she turned to Nicholas. "Are you okay?" He let out a slow breath, his eyes meeting hers. "She wants custody." Olivia froze. "What?" Nicholas's jaw tightened. "She's decided she suddenly wants to be a mother. Or at least, that's what she's claiming." Olivia glanced at Ethan, who had gone back to drawing, pretending not to listen. But she knew better. He heard everything. "She can't just take him," Olivia whispered. Nicholas's voice was low and controlled. "She can try." Olivia's stomach twisted. She didn't know the full story between Nicholas and Claire, but one thing was clear. Ethan wasn't just some trophy to be fought over. He was a child who needed love, stability. And Olivia had seen enough to know who had given him that. Nicholas wasn't perfect, but he was trying. He was there. And now, he was at risk of losing the one thing that mattered most to him. A storm was coming, and Olivia had no idea how to stop it. The weight of Nicholas's words settled heavily between them. Olivia looked at Ethan, still quietly coloring. His small hand steady despite the storm brewing around him. He was pretending not to listen, but Olivia knew better. Kids always knew when something was wrong, even when the adults tried to shield them from it. Nicholas rubbed a hand over his face, frustration evident in every tense movement. Olivia could see it. This wasn't just about a custody battle. There was something deeper here, something unspoken. "What does she really want?" Olivia asked in a hushed voice. Nicholas exhaled sharply. "Control," he said. "She doesn't actually want to raise him. She just doesn't want me to." Olivia frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Nicholas gave a bitter smile. "It does if you know Claire. She thrives on winning. And right now, I have something she doesn't." Olivia looked at Ethan again, her heart aching. "She's using him to hurt you." Nicholas's jaw tightened. "She always has." Chill ran through Olivia. She wanted to ask more, to understand the full extent of what had happened between them. But before she could, the diner door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his sharp gaze scanning the room. Olivia tensed. He wasn't just any customer. There was something about the way he carried himself. Calm, controlled, like he already owned the place. Nicholas noticed him too. His entire body went still, his hand instinctively reaching toward Ethan's chair. The man walked over slowly, his expression unreadable. "Nicholas Carter." Nicholas stood up, his posture stiff. "What do you want?" The man slid a business card onto the table. "You've been served." Olivia's stomach dropped. Nicholas didn't even glance at the card. His gaze stayed locked on the man, his expression ice-cold. "Claire sent you." The man didn't confirm or deny it. "You have a court date. 2 weeks." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The air in the diner felt heavier. Olivia looked at Nicholas, but he hadn't moved. His jaw was clenched so tight she thought he might break a tooth. Ethan looked up, confused. "Dad!" Nicholas blinked, snapping out of his frozen state. He turned to Ethan, his face instantly softening. "It's nothing, buddy." But it wasn't nothing. Olivia knew that. Nicholas knew that. After a long moment, Nicholas sat back down, staring at the untouched business card. Olivia hesitated before reaching out and resting a hand over his. He flinched slightly at the touch but didn't pull away. "You're not alone in this," she said quietly. Nicholas let out a slow breath. "I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment they just sat there in silence. But then, just as Olivia thought the night couldn't get any worse, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, expecting a message from her landlord or maybe a reminder about an overdue bill. But when she saw the number, her stomach turned to ice. It was a number she hadn't seen in years. One she never wanted to see again. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the phone, her mind racing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Nicholas noticed the change in her expression immediately. "Olivia, what is it?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's nothing," she lied, quickly shoving the phone back into her pocket. But Nicholas wasn't fooled. His sharp eyes studied her face. "Who was it?" Olivia shook her head. "It's just someone from my past." She tried to brush it off, but she could still feel Nicholas watching her. She wasn't ready to explain. Not now. Not with Ethan sitting right there, blissfully unaware of the ghosts creeping back into her life. Nicholas didn't push, but she could tell he wanted to. Instead, he simply nodded, as if telling her he wouldn't force her to talk, but he wasn't letting it go either. Olivia exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. First Nicholas's custody battle, and now this. It felt like the universe was throwing every possible challenge at them all at once. And she had a terrible feeling that this was only the beginning. The tension in Olivia's chest didn't ease, not even as she locked up the diner for the night. Nicholas had insisted on driving her home, and now, as she sat in the passenger seat with Ethan sleeping in the back, her fingers trembled against her lap. The phone call from earlier haunted her. She hadn't answered, but just seeing that number had sent a chill through her body. Nicholas glanced at her as he pulled up to her apartment building. "You've been quiet." Olivia forced a small smile. "Just a long day." He didn't believe her. She could tell by the way his hands tightened on the steering wheel. But instead of pressing, he shifted the conversation. "I don't know what's going to happen with Claire. She's powerful, and the courts usually lean toward the mother." Olivia turned to him. "You're his parent too. And you're the one who's actually been here for him." Nicholas exhaled. "That doesn't always matter." She shook her head. "Then we make it matter." For the first time that night, a flicker of hope crossed his face. He nodded once. "I'll fight for him. No matter what." Just as Olivia reached for the car door, her phone buzzed again. She didn't even have to look to know it was the same number. Nicholas noticed the hesitation in her movement. "Who is it, Olivia?" His voice was quiet, steady. She clenched her jaw. "Someone I left behind a long time ago." Nicholas didn't push, but his gaze told her he wanted to. Instead, he simply said, "You don't have to face it alone." Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to having someone say that to her. She had spent so many years fighting her own battles, convincing herself that no one would be there to help. But Nicholas was different. She nodded, barely whispering, "Good night, Nicholas." As she stepped out of the car, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. Whatever was coming, she would deal with it. Just like she always had. The next morning, the storm truly hit. Nicholas received a court order. Claire wasn't just asking for custody. She was demanding it immediately. Temporary full custody until the court date. He had barely processed the news when another blow came. Someone had leaked a story about him. Scandal. The headlines painted him as an unfit father, claiming he had neglected Ethan's needs. Fabricated reports suddenly appeared, suggesting that Ethan wasn't receiving proper care. It was all carefully orchestrated. Claire's doing. Nicholas stormed into the diner later that evening, his face pale with rage. Olivia had never seen him like this before. "She's trying to ruin me," he said through gritted teeth, tossing his phone onto the counter. The screen flashed with a news article dragging his name through the mud. "She's not just after Ethan. She wants to destroy everything." Olivia's heart pounded. There has to be a way to fight this. Nicholas let out a humorless laugh. "With what? The courts eat this kind of stuff up. They'll see the headlines before they even hear my side of the story." Olivia felt anger rising in her chest. "That's not fair. You're a good father." Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Claire doesn't care about fair. She cares about winning." A sudden thought struck Olivia like lightning. She hesitated, but then she knew. It was the only way. "What if we fight back?" she said carefully. Nicholas frowned. "What do you mean?" She bit her lip, then pulled out her phone. "She wants to control the story, right? What if we tell the truth first?" Nicholas stared at her. "Go public." Olivia nodded. "But not in a defensive way. Show people who you really are. Show them the father you are to Ethan." He hesitated, but then his eyes shifted to his son, who was playing with crayons at the counter. Slowly, Nicholas nodded. "Okay." The next morning, Olivia helped Nicholas film a simple video. No high production, no PR spin. Just him and Ethan talking about their life together. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. It was honest. And when Nicholas uploaded it, the response was immediate. People saw through Claire's tactics. Comments flooded in, supporting Nicholas, defending him. News outlets started questioning the truth of Claire's claims. The tide was turning. But the real twist came later that night. Olivia's phone rang again. The same number. This time she answered. A rough voice spoke on the other end. "You should have stayed quiet, Olivia." Her blood ran cold. And that's when she realized. Claire wasn't the only one trying to manipulate the truth. There was someone else lurking in the shadows. Someone from Olivia's past. And they had just made their move. Olivia's hands shook as she gripped the phone tighter. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in years, but she could never forget it. A voice from a past she had fought to escape. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low, controlled. A cold chuckle echoed through the line. "You think you can just move on? Start over? Some things don't stay buried, Olivia." Her heart pounded. She had expected trouble from Claire, but this was something else entirely. Someone was watching. Someone knew she had stepped into Nicholas's fight. And now, they wanted to remind her that she had unfinished battles of her own. She ended the call without another word, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Nicholas, who had been pacing the small space of the diner, noticed her expression immediately. "Olivia!" He took a step closer, concern deep in his eyes. Who was that? For a moment she considered lying, telling him it was nothing. But after everything they had been through, she couldn't. Not anymore. She exhaled slowly. "Someone I thought I left behind a long time ago." Nicholas studied her face. "Are you in danger?" She shook her head, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was the truth. "Not yet. But it's not a coincidence. Someone doesn't want me helping you." Nicholas frowned, his jaw tightening. "Claire." Olivia hesitated. Maybe. Or maybe someone she hired. A long silence passed between them. Nicholas clenched his fists. She's playing dirty. And now she's dragging you into it. Olivia looked at him, her eyes steady. Then we don't let her win. Nicholas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I don't want you to get hurt. I can take care of myself, Olivia said firmly. And I'm not walking away from this. Nicholas held her gaze, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were in this together. Over the next few days, the pressure continued to mount. More news outlets picked up Nicholas's video, painting Claire as manipulative and dishonest. Public opinion was shifting in his favor. But Claire wasn't backing down. The court date arrived faster than anyone expected. Nicholas walked into that courtroom with his head held high, Olivia sitting in the back, silently willing him strength. Claire sat across from him, composed, calculated. She had spent years perfecting the art of appearing untouchable. The legal battle was intense. Claire's lawyers painted Nicholas as an irresponsible father, twisting facts and using half-truths to manipulate the court. But Nicholas didn't waver. He spoke with honesty, with heart. He told them about Ethan, about their life together. He didn't try to be perfect, he was just real. And then the final moment came. Claire's legal team had been relentless, but they hadn't expected Olivia. When Olivia took the stand as a witness, she spoke not just as an employee or friend, but as someone who had watched firsthand what kind of father Nicholas was. She described the late nights when Ethan would wake up crying, and Nicholas was always there to comfort him. She talked about the way Ethan's face lit up whenever his father entered the room. She told the truth, the real truth, the kind that couldn't be spun or manipulated. Claire's carefully constructed case began to crumble. The judge took everything into account, weighing not just the legal arguments but the undeniable love between a father and his son. When the ruling came down, Nicholas held his breath. Full custody granted to Nicholas Carter. The words didn't sink in right away. He barely heard the rest of what the judge said. All he knew was that Ethan was safe. He had won. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her eyes stinging with relief. Nicholas turned to her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, gratitude filled his eyes. As they stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of everything finally lifted. Nicholas knelt down to Ethan, pulling him into his arms. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. Ethan grinned. "Does this mean we can get ice cream?" Nicholas laughed, his first real laugh in weeks. "Yeah, kid. As much as you want." Olivia stood back, watching the moment unfold, her heart full. She had fought battles of her own, but today, this victory belonged to them. As they walked toward the car, Nicholas glanced at Olivia. "I don't think I could have done this without you." She smiled softly. "You could have. But I'm glad you didn't have to." He hesitated for a second, then said, "Whoever called you, are you going to be okay?" Olivia looked at him, then at Ethan, who was happily humming to himself. She thought about the ghosts of her past, the battles she hadn't yet fought. And then she nodded. "Yeah," she said with more certainty than before. "I think I will be." As they drove away, Ethan chattering excitedly about all the ice cream flavors he wanted to try, Olivia allowed herself a moment to just breathe. The fight wasn't over. Life was never that simple. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't fighting alone. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference.